I've been shooting with the GH5 for about 2 years now. Pretty much everything that's on my YouTube channel and all of my latest short films have been shot with the GH5. And before that, I used the GH3 and I loved this camera. I still use it to this day. With the GH3, it's pretty much what you see is what you get as far as color profiles are concerned. But with the GH5 and the inclusion of the Vlog-L upgrade, that can change the way that you shoot a scene. And I thought it was about time to do some tests with the GH5 dynamic range and determine how to get the best image out of this sensor. Let's take a look. Okay, so here we are in Resolve, and I have a setup with a color chart, a custom focus chart, and I've got Liz in the foreground with my exposure indication in the back on the left here. And I'm just going to take you through the different exposures as up to 5 stops overexposed and 5 stops underexposed, with them pulled back to 0 or to middle gray for skin tone, and then we will kind of see what the difference is. So here's, of course, here's the properly exposed image, and I'm measuring f4 on my light meter right here on the key side of the talent's face, and everything looks good. This is the stock LUT that Panasonic claims is their like official, Vlog to Rec 709 lookup table. Here's one stop over, brought back down, and you can see my waveform here. I've got a selection of just her skin tone, just her face. And, we're right there, right in middle gray. We want something about 512 on a 10-bit scale. And, it looks pretty good still. You can get, you've got pretty much all of the detail. There's that's one over by one, and here's the properly exposed image. It doesn't look really all that much different. The image that is over by one stop, it kind of looks maybe like a little bit more contrasty, but otherwise it's a good image. And you wouldn't be in any trouble if you had exposed your talent's face, the main focal point of your image, by one stop. It would be no problem. Okay, here's 2 stops over, and it starts to kind of do some weird stuff. It's a little bit less contrasty, and you're starting to lose a little bit of the color. Now, in her face, it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. The face kind of gets washed out a little bit, and it kind of evens that skin tone out, which could be good if that's something that you're aiming for. But as compared to the one stop over or the properly exposed image, there's less contrast. Like overall, you can see kind of like where the pillows are, where this blue is meets the shadows. You can see that it's more contrasty and more vibrant of an image on just the properly exposed image or the +1 image. 2 stops over is a lot. You'd probably still be okay, but you're going to start losing detail in any of your highlights. Okay, moving on to 3 stops. 3 stops, you can see in her face it is starting to get pretty washed out. My color wheels here on my focus chart are starting to get kind of desaturated. Now, the desaturated highlights is kind of indicative of that film look, because there's supposed to be a very gradual roll-off of both the saturation and the luminance in the highlights of an image on a film emulsion. So I don't know if this is just a limitation of the sensor, or maybe Panasonic tried to design it that way, but it's a bit much. 3 stops over, I'd be very careful with, especially if there's a certain point in your talent's face that is just too much. Luckily here we don't have any harsh highlights, but if we had somebody that was it was like a sports movie or something, and there was white like sweat or something on their forehead or something like that, that would blow out probably pretty easily, and it might get you that artificial video look. Moving on, 4 stops over, we're starting to lose information in her face, just entirely. It's more washed out, and the colors are starting to shift a little bit. And you can tell, because I've isolated the images here here's her skin tone, it's starting to reflect a yellow shift in the highlights. And I think that's something that you would want to be really careful of and be a little worried about, especially if you're trying to maintain, several shots over several scenes, and, some are going to be more exposed than others, and, getting that skin tone is going to be really important. And if it's 4 stops over, this scene might be a little yellow, and this one might be more red, and that's going to be difficult in the long run. So with the skin tones isolated, you can see that in the properly exposed image, most of the skin tone is captured in this red range over here in the color wheel, where it's reflecting, you know, the natural redness, rosy color of skin. And as you start to get overexposed, here's one stop over, and then two stop over, and that's not so bad. It's still red, but then once you start getting into three stops over, it starts to shift a little bit into yellow. And then even here, you know, that's four stops over. There's a drastic change, a very drastic shift in the color. We're going from red to more of a yellowish, and even some green in the highlights there at four stops over. And you know, five stops over is just as bad. You know, with regards to, you know, the skin tone color. It kind of like is also showing me some more red here, but, you know, we're picking that up in her hair, and then also too on the shadow side of her face. There's just no information on the highlight side for that to really reflect the color, but there's definitely a color shift. Here's five stops over, no information in the highlights. Her face is completely blown out. Colors are pretty washed out. You cannot retrieve that, but of course, with five stops over on a GH5, you know, it's to be expected. Okay, and then moving on to the underexposed image. Here's, again, just for reference, the properly exposed image. Here's one stop under, and looks pretty good. It's a little muddy. You can tell how there's less contrast in the darker areas, like over here in the kitchen where the frame meets the wall. It's a little less contrasty, and although it looks a little more saturated though, which is kind of interesting. And it's starting to make me think if maybe Panasonic has programmed some type of a linear kind of a function to dictate how much saturation is in the image based on the luminance. But not bad. Still pretty good image, you know. That's one stop under, brought back up just a tiny bit, and to meet middle gray on her face. And I'd say pretty good. I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. Here's two stops over. We're starting to show a decent amount of grain, depending. This is all at 400 ISO, by the way. So here's the properly exposed image, and that's one stop under, two stops under. Two stops under, the color looks pretty good, and it's still pretty vibrant and contrasty. I'm starting to show a lot of grain, though. It's kind of like, regardless of the ISO, if you have portions of your image that are underexposed, it's going to show grain. Vlog does not do any in-camera processing for noise reduction, so you're supposed to denoise it in the long run after you've processed it and edited it and colored it. You're supposed to do denoising like at the end. Here's three stops under. It shows quite a bit of noise. It's not terrible, but it's certainly enough to scare, you know, some DPs if they're not into that look. But as far as the color is concerned, it's still pretty vibrant. You can see the color, you know, contrast is there. Four stops under, we're seeing like a ton of noise, and in her face especially, that's going to be kind of a rough clip to watch if you... So we've got under by four stops. That is very noisy and beyond my taste. I would not want to use any image like this, especially right here in her face. It just looks like video. It's too dark. Nighttime is almost never portrayed in film as no light. There has to be something there. And it's kind of like an optical illusion of the mind. When you look out of the window at nighttime and you see there's kind of like bluish cast, you kind of have to create that in a film for the camera to be able to pick up on it. And of course, the five stops under is kind of hardly even worth talking about because it's just so bad. I would never use anything like this with her face under five stops under. And of course, you know, this is very extreme. Like you can see, this is like what the image would look like if it was uncorrected, you know. And so we're really pushing it to like the extreme. It could be okay if you are shooting something and of course your focus is over here. But again, I measured five stops under on her face, and you know, it's hardly worth talking about it. Okay, so here we have an indoor scene, which might be a little bit more common in a situation where you have somebody sitting in the foreground, or you have a couple of characters talking to each other, and then you've got like some natural daylight, or you have an uncontrolled light source happening behind your characters or in the background. And in this setup, I've got the focus chart on the left, and I've got my exposures over here on the slate in the bottom left. What I'm actually doing here is shooting like f16 worth of light at Liz here, and then I'm using ND to increase and decrease the exposure over the entire image. In the previous version, I was using a combination of ND and moving the distance of the light, from the subject to get that the correct exposure. But in this case, it's going to be an overall frame increase and decrease. Okay, a couple of notes about exposure. The color on the left side of the frame here where the chart is, that's not going to accurately represent the color because I'm balanced to tungsten for Liz's face, and I've got daylight coming in the back, and there's a light off to the left here that's shooting daylight colored light onto the chart and onto the slate. That's just because we kind of ran out of time and I wasn't able to get another tungsten over there on the left. So colors aren't going to be right, but in this situation, we're going to be looking at the exposure pretty closely. So just like the last scene setup, I've got 5 stops of overexposure, 5 stops of underexposure brought back to middle gray for the key side of the talent's face. Here is the properly exposed image. Looks pretty good. Highlight retention is decent. I can still see color in the background. Key side of the face looks pretty good. And you can still see detail in the dark areas of the image too, which is also good. There's not too much noise, but this is at 400 ISO. Looks pretty good. Colors are good. Okay, so here is one stop overexposed, and as far as the key side of the face, it looks pretty good. It doesn't look any different to me than the properly exposed image. However, immediately in the background, you can see something jump out here. The highlights begin to blow out, and this is completely white right here as compared to the properly exposed image. So here is +1, and here is the properly exposed image. Now keep in mind, this is the manufacturer's recommended setting for properly exposed images in Vlog. So as I had mentioned before, if you're shooting in Cine D and the little exposure meter on the bottom of the camera, it'll say like over by 1 stop. But if you flip over to Vlog, that will change and it'll go to the middle and say, oh, your image is exposed properly. So there might be people out there that are shooting like this and considering this to be the properly exposed image. But of course, I used my light meter to determine, how much light is falling directly onto the subject and based it that way. So it still looks pretty good though, all of the color is there, and you can still see detail in the shadows, and in most of the highlights all the detail is there, so there's really nothing to be worried about, as opposed to perhaps the properly exposed image at 0. This one has more noise in it. Some people may be a little more concerned about that than others. As I also had mentioned already, Vlog does not have any denoising in camera, so it actually purposefully does not do any denoising. You're supposed to denoise the image in the post-production process after finishing your edit. So if you're like me, I like to use Neat Video at the end of my short films and stuff to clean the noise off of an image. That it wouldn't be a big deal, but you do get less noise with a image that is overexposed by 1 stop. Okay, moving on. So here's overexposed by 2 stops. Her face still looks pretty good. As far as the color is, I would say that it still maintains the original skin tone, and her hair looks pretty good. Colors on the chart look good as well. But as to be expected, you see in the background here that the color is completely missing from the highlights of the sky, and there's a little bit of kind of a color clipping going on in between where I guess this is like fall, because this is some of her hair, and I think there's maybe some plants and stuff back there, but it kind of rolls off all the way to white, and it creates this kind of like saturated edge. So that's 2 stops over. But as far as her face is concerned, it still looks pretty good. If you overexpose by 2 stops, you would probably be fine. I wouldn't foresee any issues with maintaining a good image for the face. So 3 stops over, we're starting to see that the key side of her face is blowing out. We're losing some detail, we're losing some color, we're getting that shift right here in this section. It starts to kind of turn yellow, and compared to the redness of her face. And the background is completely blown out. There's no color information back here whatsoever, completely white. And the colors are a little bit washed out. It's very similar to the other scene setup that we did with the controlled nighttime scene, but it's reacting a little bit differently to the information in the background. 4 stops over, the face is blowing out completely, and we are not able to retrieve any information from the key side of her face. We get this kind of yellow red stripe color shift going on in the highlights, which is not great. If you were 4 stops over on the key side of your talent's face, you'd be in some trouble. You would not be able to retrieve that information. The shadows look pretty good as far as noise is concerned. Going back to 3 stops and then 2 stops and then properly exposed. Interestingly, yes, you can see that there is more noise. So if we do 1, 2, 3, this one is 4 stops over. There's less noise, so that is good. But 4 stops over measured on the key side of her face. So, okay, 5 stops over, the information in her face is completely gone. You cannot retrieve any of that. You still have the color shift in the saturated highlight section. You can even see some of her hair is starting to go like green, and which is like really not desirable. The window in the background completely blown out, and then even some of the information over here is in the background is completely lost. But I mean, if you miss your target by 5 stops, then I'd say you probably have some other things that you need to worry about. You're not doing your job. Okay. All right, moving on. Here is the properly exposed image again. And we're back to the key side of the face at 0 with the ND in it. Colors look pretty good. The sky came back. We see all of the information in the highlights in the background. And moving on. So here is 1 stop under. And they look pretty similar. As far as the colors are concerned, I can't really notice much of a difference at the properly exposed image, and then here's 1 stop under. It's a little less contrasty, and of course there is more noise, and that is to be expected, but it's not by too much, which is pretty good. Again, if you're like me and you use noise reduction, then it probably wouldn't matter that much. Information is all there, looks pretty good. 2 stops under, it gets a little muddy. You can see that there's a color shift in the shadows, and this is probably due to the noise that is in the image there. So it is, it's kind of green, kind of brown. 2 stops under is, I'd be really careful with. Some DPs may not like that much noise, kind of like the last scene. But, I mean, I might be okay with it because I would reduce the noise, add my own grain. But same information's in the highlights there. 3 stops under, we're seeing a lot of noise. This is, this is like a heavy film grain look. And I don't know what it is, but the GH5 noise pattern, it's got like a lot of like yellow and blue in it. And it's weird. It's kind of, it's maybe green. I don't know, but it's not very aesthetically pleasing. I mean, the size and shape of the grain, I would say, is good, but the color is not desirable, at least for me. Pretty muddy. Information's there in the highlights, which is good. The key side of her face looks pretty good. And you could conceivably come in here and, crush your shadows even more if you wanted to look like that, and kind of help get rid of some of that noise. But, even a lot of your midtones are going to have that noise, especially on her face as well. And I'm not a fan of that, but it is an option. Okay, moving on. So we've got under by 4 stops. Even more noise. It's even muddier. The contrast begins to disappear. and it's difficult to bring that back in. Here is kind of like, here's what the image looks like, you know, just straight out of the box, and that's what it would be with a proper exposure on the key side of her face. We're also getting that color shift again. It's a little bit green, kind of brown. We're losing that rosy red skin tone color that we all love. And here we are at 5 stops under. It's kind of like the last setup. It's hardly worth talking about because there is so much noise, even on like the key side of her face, that it is probably, I'd consider it unusable. However, we can see quite a bit of information out the window with the stuff in the sky. And that could be a benefit? I don't know. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, I think it's really interesting to see the way that the GH5 handles the highlight roll-off and the way that it handles color at very extreme overexposures. I also think it's really interesting that a lot of people out there are recommending that you shoot like 1 stop over if you're shooting vlog on a camera like that can do log. And I think based on my tests, I'd go on the record and say that shooting 1 stop over is not a hard and fast rule, and that you wouldn't always want to do that. Prime example is right here in this scene where the properly zero exposed image has information in the sky in the background, and then the +1 image has that kind of highlight blowout out of the back of the window there that I'm not a fan of. And furthermore, if you're the kind of person that uses the exposure indication at the bottom of the screen of your camera there, and you're shooting at vlog, and you've been told that you should be shooting 1 stop over when you're shooting at vlog, but didn't know that exposure indication changes when you switch over to vlog, which I didn't know that for the longest time either, you might be shooting at 2 stops over, which you lose even more highlight information, which personally I like to have. I think an image looks a lot better when it's properly exposed and you can see the color in the background, even though it's real bright and there's not a lot of stuff back there. The way that the highlights clip in a camera like the GH5 is kind of a dead giveaway. That's a DSLR. So a lot of us have been in the pursuit of the cinematic image, and in my mind I'd say that a good highlight information is one of the key factors in making a cinematic image. Okay, so what kind of a conclusion can I draw from these 2 tests? Well, as I had mentioned before, I think after doing these tests and reviewing the footage, that if I'm in a situation where I've got highlights in the background that I cannot control or are difficult to control, I am not going to be shooting 1 stop over. I'm going to be shooting at proper exposure and even 1 stop under, because I think you can get more information in the highlights and retain more detail overall for someone like me where I use noise reduction afterwards. However, on the flip side, if you are in an environment where you can control all of the lighting, you could overexpose by 1 stop in order to get the benefit of less noise and what would probably be a cleaner and sharper image in the long run. But for someone like me, I kind of fail to see the benefit because I like to use a noise reduction algorithm like Neat Video at the end of the post-production process, and then I add my own film grain in order to kind of like custom make that for every single film. And so for someone like me, it really doesn't matter. So overall, I'd say from here on out, for all of my film shoots, I'm going to expose my image at the proper exposure using my light meter and go from there. And don't forget, your eye is always going to be the last deciding factor about the way an image looks. If you do 1 stop over or 1 stop under, 2 stops under, whatever the case might be, you're going for a look for that film or for that scene, and you want to make sure that that matches the tone of what you're doing. And sometimes it's going to take going a stop over, stop under, more contrast, less contrast. It's all going to be an artistic expression of your choice. There's no hard and fast rule about what you should be doing as far as exposure is. For me, I'm going to be hitting 0 every single time, or if I've got lots of uncontrolled light in the background of my image, I might even go a stop under. Okay, that wraps up today's video. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully I've inspired some of you GH5 users out there to assess the way that you're exposing your images and maybe try it like this too. Follow me on Instagram for more cool filmmaking stuff. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about this particular type of video. And until next time, thanks for watching.